Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today we're going to look at some of the effects of uranium, and particularly if you happen to live in the Great Lakes area, and I am in Toronto, we are very concerned about some of the ways in which uranium is being processed and handled in our area. And so my assistant Adam Wynn will join me in talking with a man named Zach Reuter, who is also in Toronto at the moment, and is both of them are quite aware of some of the risky things going on in the Toronto area involving uranium. So, hello, Zach. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Good. Nice to see you here. And Adam, say hello to the whole world.
Hello. It's good to be here as well, instead of just watching behind the scenes.
Adam is my right hand, whatever that means. Anyway, hello, Zach. Let's talk about the BWXT. Is that the name of the company, which I had never heard of until recently? I mean, it's not a brand name that I'm familiar with. Tell me all about what they do and why we should be a little bit apprehensive.
Well, I guess it's the acronym for Babcock-Wilcox Technologies. And they are a long-time player in the nuclear weapons and nuclear power industry. They were the ones, I believe, who manufactured the 3 Mile Island reactor, which had a catastrophic accident and polluted the town in Pennsylvania. Of which, shout out to Libby Halevi of Nuclear Hot Seat podcast, who is a survivor of the 3 Mile Island accident.
She, by the way, was one of my guests. I did a talk show with her.
Oh, great.
And she is a fabulous person because she does every week. She does a talk show about risky things having to do with radiation. Bless her heart, you know. Wonderful work.
Yeah, like really thorough work, really passionate work. We're really lucky to have someone like Libby Halevi as a journalist who's covering issues of radiation, especially in a time when mainstream media is contracting and also largely bought by large interests. So it's crucial to have independent media like Libby Halevi on the scene.
I agree.
Yeah, but back to BWXT, I first became aware of them in 2000 and maybe 15 or 16 when they signed an agreement with General Electric Hitachi to purchase their nuclear fuel fabrication facilities in Toronto and Peterborough. These are two facilities that have been really embattled over the past few years due to the public's increasing awareness of the effects of their operations. I got involved in 2010 when then General Electric Hitachi in Peterborough got permission to process enriched uranium 25 meters away from an elementary school in Peterborough in secret, in the form of a license amendment by the Nuclear Safety Commission. And one of the requirements of their license was that they consult the public. And their version of consulting the public was sort of slipping a little flyer or a little advertising note in a larger sort of a portion of junk mail, you know, like the advertisements from Canadian Tire and stuff like that, saying, we're General Electric Hitachi, we're your neighbor, let us know if you have any questions. And they counted that as public consultation. And then at the hearing, when I heard Peter Mason, then CEO of GE Hitachi, saying, we went above and beyond our duty to consult the public. And it's quite natural to think that the public was satisfied because we didn't hear anything from them. I knew then that if they were willing to blatantly lie to the commission and regulator about that they must be lying about other things. And then that has started a now almost close to now 12 year battle for transparency, with that entity. So it used to be General Electric, and now it's BWXT.
Is that when they became BWXT was 11 years ago, or?
No, it was, sorry, it's hard to remember. I think it was like 2015. It was just recently. They never really explained
you were
why
fighting. Sorry, you were fighting Hitachi GE.
Yeah.
Even before they became BWXT.
BWXT, correct? Yeah. And General Electric in Peterborough, is known for poisoning generations of workers and families with PCBs, asbestos, and contaminating Little Lake and our Otonabee River system up there. There's a huge amount of former workers who have ongoing workplace safety insurance board claims. It's been big exposés about the number of workers with terminal cancers there. And there's also a Toronto General Electric facility, but that's now turned into Davenport Village condos. And I think because it's in a large city, it's kind of easy to lose track of all the people who come and go. Whereas in Peterborough, there's a lot of community and a lot of visibility to the fact that all these workers and their families and people living around there have gotten really sick over the years.
Okay. Now, but how much was that known, and how much did you contribute to the expose, if it were?
Well, it was known, and the way that the General Electric explained it is we've always worked with the best information available to us at the time. So when I was at the commission in 2010, I found out that there was a joint license for a facility in Toronto, not far from where I grew up in Toronto. And then when I went to Toronto and I sort of started knocking on doors in 2011 or 12 and asking people, do you know what this facility does in Toronto? And most of them thought it made televisions or air conditioners. And they were surprised to find out that it was indeed a nuclear fuel fabrication process that processes about 150 tons of uranium per month. They take yellow cake uranium dioxide fuel powder. And they
all of that goes on right here in Toronto, all the way
right in Toronto. Yeah.
Whoa, that's news to me.
That's news to you. Okay, yeah. And it was news to the people living around there.
What's the difference between what they do in Toronto and what they do in Peterborough?
Toronto is by magnitude exponentially more radioactive than what they do in Peterborough. In Toronto, they take the uranium fuel that comes in drums and the powder, and they cook it at 1650 degrees centigrade into fuel pellets that will then go into the zirconium fuel rods. And basically in Peterborough, they receive the pellets from the Toronto facility and they shave them down. They coat them with a toxic heavy metal called beryllium, which is sort of a lubricant of sorts. And then they insert them there. So the current issue with toxic exposure in Peterborough is actually from that beryllium process. There's a beryllium stack that is like 2 feet away from the sidewalk and right across the street from the elementary school. And there's been increasing levels of beryllium in the soil, but they have done tests and they've concluded that there's no way that the beryllium stack that releases the beryllium across the street could have impacted the rising levels of soil. Because it just...
Where else would it have come from, please?
I think they think that it kind of occurs naturally as well. Beryllium is very difficult to test for. But back to Toronto.
Now, wait a minute. I don't want you to. I don't want to let go of this.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe? What do you think? I mean, if they're finding beryllium out in, did you say in the kids' playground?
In the kids' playground, yes, yeah.
They're finding beryllium, and you would normally find beryllium out in my backyard, would you?
I think you might find trace amounts, but there were elevated levels. Even the medical officer of health said it was concerning. But the trick of the regulator and the industry and the regulator, which is like an industry captured regulator, is to always say it's within the background and it's definitely below the safety standard. And the safety standard is usually set so high as to say that anything that goes on below is not a problem. But when you see increasing levels, and there are air emissions right across from where there are increasing levels, to me, it just says that the precautionary principle should apply, and they shouldn't really be releasing beryllium, especially next to an elementary school.
And do they release? I mean, do they say it's constant? Well, how it has to get in and out of the container somehow. So
Yeah.
where does it come from? And how, what do they do with it? And then where does it go to? Where do they send it?
I'm not an expert on beryllium because it's coating. It's the coating and lubricant between the zirconium fuel rods and the pellets. And in that process, I mean, just anecdotally, the workers kind of, you know, and I've heard this in nuclear facilities and places that I've toured in the States and stuff like that. Former workers will say there's a death room in the facility. And in Peterborough, in the nuclear operation of General Electric, which is now BWXT, the beryllium room is known as the death room because it is so highly toxic.
So that means don't go in there or you die, or a lot of people who've been near that room have died. What, you know, when you call it a death room, what does that mean?
It means working there is associated with toxic exposures that can lead to and have led to long-term terminal illness.
Okay. All right, that's good enough warning for me. Anyway, I'm leading you off your narrative. Why don't you go back to telling the story you want to tell?
So in Toronto, people really didn't know what this place does, and they are releasing uranium up the stack into the air and down the drain. In 2012, they released 2.2 kilograms of uranium down into Toronto's stormwater sewer. And then we've seen flooding events afterwards. Sorry, 2009, they released 2.2 kilograms of uranium into the sewer. So basically, if it doesn't make it out to Lake Ontario, uranium is like a heavy particle. It'll sink to the bottom of the sewer. Then we've seen flooding events since then. So basically, the flooding events can kick that uranium back into the local environment, into the neighborhood. But I'm more concerned with the air exposure to the people living right there. You know, their lungs are inhaling and exhaling, and the company will say, "Oh, the radiation that's released from these stacks is so little compared to an X-ray or a pack of cigarettes or a flight from Montreal to Vancouver." But that's measured in something called gamma radiation, which is like a long wave radiation. The chief concern with the inhalation of uranium particles from this plant, this operation, is alpha radiation. Natural uranium is an alpha emitter, so that means it's a very short wave. So if you inhale one of those particles, it won't penetrate the skin, but if you've got a cut or you inhale it, that can lodge in the lung, cross the blood-brain barrier, and then it can kind of act like a little ember or a little radioactive disintegration. And the danger is, if you inhale that and it's in you forever, it's going to be disrupting the cells. If it kills the cells, that's fine. But if it damages a cell and the cell replicates, that's where you can induce cancer. But you could die of natural causes before that cancer metastasizes. But there's no way of knowing what your cancer is from. But anecdotally, in that area in Toronto, where there was PCB work and there has been nuclear fuel processing since the 1950s, there's a lot of cancer in that area. You know, a young mother.
You use the word PCB work. What explain that?
They were working with transistors, sort of electric transistors that you see on poles and stuff like that. So General Electric in Toronto on the east side of Lansdowne had the nuclear fuel operation. And on the west side of Lansdowne, they worked with the PCBs for electric transistors and things like that.
And that stuff is dangerous itself.
Yeah, it's dangerous, but now that's all been sort of taken away. The soil's been taken away, and now there's townhouses on that site.
If we maybe could talk a bit more about the site history within the Toronto context, I think that's a very interesting element that we should maybe delve into in a bit more detail. Because you mentioned the 1950s and the 1960s, and I live just down at the bottom of Lansdowne Avenue, about a mile or two from this plant. I do have some photos here, which I could put on screen share, which will kind of show the context of this. But when this plant opened in the 50s and the 60s, the area surrounding it was largely industrial. The sites across the street were also owned by General Electric. They made all sorts of different components there. Now, most of the industrial facilities in this neighborhood where the plant is located have moved out of the area. The former building just up the street, which was a metallurgy foundry, is now a multi-million-dollar redevelopment that has very high-end lofts. There's a townhouse development across the street, and they're now doing excavation. I'll show you a photograph here. They're doing excavation. So this gray beige building here is the processing plant. And this site here across the street, which is a big hole in the ground, is being prepared for a new residential development. Now, I'll point to your attention to this brown building here. This high rise is 1011, so 1011 Lansdowne Avenue. It's one of the most notorious addresses in Toronto for emergency services. They have generally multiple false alarms a week for fire, police, ambulance. This building, they've also partnered with CAMH for outpatient housing for homeless and schizophrenic people in this building. It's a very notorious building for everything from drug dealing to prostitution to violent crime. It's immediately next to and less than 100 meters from this uranium plant. So if there's a radiological accident, it's going to be incredibly difficult to do any type of evacuation. So that building was built in the 70s. So even starting a few decades after this plant was opened, the area began to have development into kind of more residential uses. And now it's almost entirely residential around it. I also want to draw your attention to the active rail corridor that's located less than 15 meters from the plant. So this is another concern, is that this rail corridor, which was put in the 19th century, in the 1880s, 1890s, is only 50 meters from the uranium processing facility. So you can see here, this
sorry, is that a freight train or something there?
Train going. Yes, there's been 2 derailments in the past decade on this rail corridor within 5 miles of this plant. So if you see here, this is another photo. So this is a freight train going by the plant. I've heard that there's also, maybe Zach can speak more to this, there's also an external hydrogen tank of something like 9,000 gallons sitting outside this plant for processing purposes. So there's been 2 derailments on this rail corridor that was put in the 19th century. That's now, that's only 15 meters away from the uranium processing facility. And now the guidelines in Toronto say that you have to build at least 30 meters away from the rail corridor to have a buffer zone if there's a train accident. And this plant's only 15 meters. It's been grandfathered in from an era back when safety standards were more lax. Here's another angle of the plant looking, this is looking west. And I want to draw your attention to, maybe I have another angle here. Yes, here we go, back to this photo. So this building on the left here, that's at 1011 Lansdowne Avenue, high rise I mentioned, the very notorious address. Immediately across the street are 2 condos known as fuse condos that were put in the 2010s. These are 20 or 30 story condominium towers. They kept the base of the old factory and warehouse building and then built on top of them. So there's a heritage element where there's now a grocery store, but this area that's surrounding them is now almost entirely residential. And this uranium processing facility is now a relic from the mid 20th century. And even before then, when this area was largely GE lands and a largely industrial area. Now that industrial area, the former buildings, as I mentioned, are now residential. And in some cases, they've been turned into theaters, art galleries, things like this. So this plant is really a relic in the surrounding area in the Toronto context. I'm not so familiar with the Peterborough context. I do know the Prince of Wales public school that you're mentioning across the street, but maybe we should talk a bit more about that.
Well, that was a really excellent summary, Adam. That's really good. I'll just quickly mention, which may be of interest to Meta. BWXT is also currently an active nuclear weapons manufacturer. They work with ballistic missiles that come from submarines, and they make casings for plutonium cores and pits. And those plutonium pits are used in warheads and Trident missiles. They can kill millions of people as well. So, and they also export some depleted uranium.
But my impression is that Canada has a rule that we don't produce plutonium or uranium or any other fissile materials that are to be used in weapons.
That's correct. So this is BWXT US, that's their operations in the United States.
But our stuff doesn't make its way into warheads, or does it?
It's unclear. BWXT, this company, 2 weeks of the year processes fuel to be exported to the States. Where that goes and what it's used for is quote unquote proprietary commercial information. So they're not really willing to share what that uranium that they export to the States is used
I mean, if we have this principle that we don't make stuff for nuclear warheads, then I mean, what you're saying is, if I understand you, that we don't know whether that's being enforced or not. Is it a principle, or is it a real treaty, or what kind of teeth does this agreement have? Well, binding, and how official is it, or is it just a gentleman's agreement kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it is. It's sort of like the non-proliferation treaty is actually the vehicle for nuclear proliferation, the way that Canada loaned CANDU technology to India and Pakistan, and they renounced their membership in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty on the eve of their test explosions. So Toronto has a peace garden. We are calling ourselves a nuclear weapons-free city, yet we have an active nuclear weapons manufacturer working with uranium. You know, back in the Iraq War, there was supposedly, you know, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But it turns out, you know, we have a huge stockpile of uranium in Toronto's West End. But back to Adam's questions. It was largely industrial, but there were also homes for workers in that area predating the establishment of the General Electric campus. So you're definitely right on that. There has been a lot of rumors over the years that surrounding buildings, even south of DuPont, are connected by way of tunnel, and there was weapons development that went on there, but all of that is kept really kind of secretive.
If I may build on that point a bit regarding that kind of complex in the DuPont area, the infrastructure in that area is still World War II era in some cases. They have increased the development, but I went up and took some photos a few months ago, and if you look at manhole cover, where we mentioned the sewers and how they have a permit to release, I think it's 9,000 kilograms of uranium into the Toronto sewer system each year. Now, Pippa Feinstein yesterday mentioned that may have been reduced recently. But if you look at the manhole cover underneath the BWXT sign outside the Toronto plant, it has the date 1949 stamped on it. So the sewers underneath this plant are likely just immediately after World War II. And if you walk around the outside of the plant, you'll notice the retaining walls on the east side are crumbling and need repair. There's an open drain cover on the north side of the plant along Brandon Avenue, which is next to the downspout from when they used to have the downspouts connect to the system. I have some photos here showing this. So this is just outside the uranium processing facility. Lord knows what this goes down into. But if they're releasing uranium into this sewer system, that's venting immediately from the sewer system under the plant. The retaining walls on the side are falling apart. This is some type of emergency shutoff from the wartime period for infrastructure. And this is the uranium plant here. And this is the residential development going in across the street. I want to draw your attention to the bridge as well. So Anne Frisch, a year or two ago, sent me some materials about infrastructure and the transport of nuclear materials. So I mentioned this rail corridor that's only 15 meters from this plant. This bridge is from 1931, immediately about 15 meters again away from the plant. We know that the aging bridges on rail corridors are a major, major, major concern in both Canada and the US because they're not maintained properly. They are crumbling. They can also be the target of terrorism incidents. If somebody drives a truck into that and collapses bridges, you could have a rail accident. Now, I mentioned there were 2 derailments along this rail corridor. Some other things to mull over is that this rail corridor is a major east-west corridor for the transportation of explosives and hazardous materials, as well as radiological materials. For many years,
just to interrupt, the Lac-Mégantic rail car rolled right past the uranium plant and exploded.
Really, in Lac-Mégantic, there's a
uranium. What's that?
Well, the one that went through, it went past this plant here.
Yeah, and then exploded in Quebec and was a terrible fracked gas explosive disaster.
Yeah. So for many years in Canada, the rail companies were not disclosing to the municipalities, from my understanding, what was being transported on the rail corridors. Mm-hmm. Toronto started an investigative piece where they stood on one of the rail bridges for like a 12-hour period and took photos of all the hazardous tags on the rail cars, because if you get a photo of those, you can cross-reference. Each hazardous material has a numerical identifier that you can cross-reference with an international database. And they found stuff like explosives, highly toxic pesticides, in some cases radiological materials that are going through this rail corridor through the middle of downtown Toronto. And as I mentioned, there's 2 derailments that have happened on this rail corridor in the past few years. None, fortunately, near the uranium plant, but one was only just by Christie Gardens and the other was just by Bathurst Street.
Yeah.
Where in one case, what happened was the train went over the switch and the other train going the other way hadn't cleared the line and they collided. And the other one, the train just derailed off the tracks. Another concerning thing is that this rail corridor has a safety fence. People have cut holes in it to cross the line on St. Clarence Avenue because they don't want to have to walk all the way around the plant to get to the other side. So they just cut holes in it and cross the tracks there. I don't want to be an alarmist, but this opens up a whole slew of concerns around safety and security of this plant. If you have people trespassing onto the rail corridor, you could easily derail a train if you know how to, especially when there's a big gaping hole in the fence next to the uranium processing facility. It's really alarming, the state kind of around the exterior of this plant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You guys are giving me, I'm going to have nightmares tonight, I'm afraid. But thank you. Go ahead. I'm a big girl. I'll take it. I imagine the rest of us need to know this.
So, yeah, that's a concern. You know, they're not really willing to speculate on what would happen if there was an explosion of that hydrogen tank. Anecdotally, hydrogen explosions like in Germany or something like that can, you know, they have the capacity potentially to level the building. So if you have 150 tons of uranium in powdered or pellet form, you have the possibility to make a huge dirty bomb there. I don't like to speculate on this. It's dangerous there. In 1999, they had a near disaster with a hydrogen explosion already there that resulted in a big fire up the stack. That resulted in an evacuation. Yeah, I can send you some links on that. You know, someone should file a Freedom of Information request to get better details on what actually happened there. But the thing is like you're cooking uranium 24/7 at 1650 degrees centigrade with a lot of propellant. That's a lot of heat. They have cooling towers that are releasing vapor all the time, but they also have 6 stacks that release uranium into the air. So the uranium that they release is really fine particles, like smaller than a hair. These are the particles that make it out of their filters. So they have several sort of carbon filters, and then they're releasing it in 6 directions. So if you're living in one of those new condos or anywhere, you could be inhaling particles of uranium. Especially if, you know, if it's snowing or if it's rainy or foggy, you know, and there's lots of condensation, those particles are just hanging in the air. So, you know, they'll say, oh, you know, we only release like, you know, 5 grams a year. Like, first of all, when we had a meeting at the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission in 2013, I said, well, how can we believe that you're releasing only this much per year. They say we have, they would say, we have independent third parties that verify our testing results. And then I'd say, you know, what's the name of the independent third party? And then they'd say that's proprietary commercial information. So there's just all these cul-de-sacs, there's all these dead ends. But even if you take the numbers that they're giving you, in every gram of uranium that they release, so these microscopic, tasteless, odorless, sightless particles are the tiniest particles. There's trillions of particles per gram. You know, in Toronto, I live near the Cadbury chocolate factory. If the wind is blowing, you know, southwest from the factory, it smells like chocolate. In Peterborough, where I live near the, I lived in Peterborough actually a block away from General Electric, but maybe 5 or 6 blocks over was the Quaker Oats factory, and the wind was going in that direction. It smelled like oatmeal. So, you know, uranium, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, you can't see it. It's a silent killer. It's and it's carcinogenic. It's a deadly toxin, and it's not only carcinogenic, it's a heavy metal. So heavy metals are also dangerous as well for your, you know, liver and kidneys.
Do they do anything valid, anything worthwhile with this stuff?
I'd say no, it's not all bad. I mean, the energy that we're using right now is most likely coming from Pickering and Darlington, and they're supplying all of the pellets that go to Pickering and Darlington, and we're using that right now. Their customers are Ontario Power Generation, so this is really kind of collectively owned as a burden. You know, we've taken the benefits of this electricity, but now we're saddled with you know, over 50 years of the result, which is highly toxic, highly radioactive waste that has accumulated, that's come through Toronto, that's gone through Pickering, that's been mined in, you know, Dene and Cree territory. So not only have they created power for us, they've created a burden of this toxic legacy of this nuclear fuel waste that they're now trying to find a place to bury. And I think what we really need to say is, you know, before you can bury it so that you can just keep on making more because you say you have the solution, is we need to stop producing it. Full stop. So, yeah.
Which means stop nuclear power plants.
Stop nuclear power plants, yeah. I mean, here's where I get a little bit controversial, is I'm not a proponent of green energy. I think that there are environmental trade-offs there that I personally am not willing to make for any communities that are affected. So I think that we really need to prioritize energy conservation, but I think we need to sort of reframe the logical sequence of how do we keep the lights on and save the planet. It's always one then the other, keeping the lights on and then save the planet. And I think if we reverse the order in terms of the way we discuss our energy use and the planet, saying, how do we save the planet and keep the lights on? But why don't we save the planet before anything else? So even if that means turning off the lights, but I think that if that's the impending threat of turning off the lights, we will find ways to adapt. So when you reverse the order of how do we keep the lights on and then as an afterthought save the planet, you're always making trade-offs. Like there's some alarming statistics about, you know, covering the whole world with solar panels, windmills, all of these things. But when it comes down to it, I think that we need to shift the way we think of energy.
Well, I know that I have a lot of conversations about this kind of thing every week almost. And even a couple of days ago, one of the people I interviewed was saying that because of the expansion of technology and stuff around the world and growth, there will be a need for 3 times as much electricity as we're producing now. So it isn't just a matter of keeping the lights on, but turning on a lot more lights And I don't think that many people have the same concerns you do about the side effects of wind and solar. But that's a different conversation. If you want to talk about that and talk about those negative effects, you can come back and be on a show with somebody who believes in it. It'd be a good conversation, because I haven't heard anybody else say that there are as many negative side effects of renewable energy as there are from the fossil fuels and the nuclear.
I agree with that, but I think that even if the climate concern were solved, I think that the problem is the amount of energy we're using and what we're using with what we're doing with that energy. And we really need to focus as a society not only on efficiency, but reductions, reducing the amount of energy we use.
As I understand it, there's a lot going on that it just naturally, that not naturally, but there is a real move in the direction of conservation. Things are becoming more efficient. People are finding ways of doing things with less energy. So in that sense, there is a reduction in the amount per whatever that you create, but the amount that you create is going to increase. So we're actually going to need 3 times as much energy, even if we do conserve.
Yeah,
so I mean, that's, I'm not the expert here, and this isn't what we wanted to talk about today. So I think we needed a different conversation in which we have that discussion with somebody who knows more than I do, or not. You're welcome to be part of it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Go on. I keep
Zach, have you?
Yeah, Adam.
Have you noticed within Peterborough? I want to go back to one of your previous points regarding the intergenerational connection to General Electric in Peterborough, and how you said that multiple families have been poisoned by the activities of General Electric in Peterborough. The CBC just did a documentary on this within the past year or two called, I think it was The Town of Widows, documenting the levels of cancer and illnesses of former workers of the plant. In some cases, there's reports of people coming home that worked with asbestos, and their wives would shake out their clothing from work, and the asbestos would come raining down from the clothing after they came from the GE plant. Do you find that there may be any resistance, or what is the public opinion on these activities within the Peterborough context? Peterborough has also been described as a company town at times, particularly around the wartime period with the activities of GE and then Quaker Oats. And there were a few very large companies that many people in the city worked with. And it was built to recognize the activities and at the danger of this, or is it kind of a mixed bag of reactions from the public in Peterborough?
It is. So notwithstanding this company has been proven to have poisoned, workers and families, and it's well known. Not only that, but they're wanting to move the Toronto facility from Toronto to Peterborough, possibly because, the development going on around the Toronto facility is massive. Davenport Village, another 3,000 units, the condos right across the street. But because the Pickering nuclear station is going to be going offline, hopefully sooner rather than later, but it's going offline in a few years, they're going to be losing half of their market. So right now they're producing half of all uranium use in Canadian reactors, but they're going to be only making half of that. So a quarter. BWXT is heavily invested in developing the next generation of small modular nuclear reactors, a new breed of nuclear reactors, which, Libby Halevi is called mobile Chernobyl, because there's going to be these small reactors all over the place because the public's largely against building new reactors. These reactors run on enriched uranium. So there's precedent to show that company in that site in Peterborough has already worked with some enriched uranium and has already tried to work with enriched uranium. The huge speculation is that they're not just going to be working with natural uranium for CANDU reactors, but they're going to want to use that site in Peterborough for enriched uranium. And sometimes they have acronyms like low enriched uranium or slightly enriched uranium, but these are just euphemisms for enriched uranium. So the public is really divided.
Yeah.
So the public is really divided right now. There's a group called CARNS, Citizens Against Radioactive Neighborhoods, that are fighting it. They're taking the Nuclear Safety Commission to federal court right now to review the decision. But they're taking the CNSC and the BWXT to court largely over technicality. And that technicality is that under the Nuclear Safety Control Act, there was a requirement for the license fulfillment that they submit their site plan and their detailed environmental monitoring plans. But they didn't release those detailed environmental monitoring plans because of possibly sensitive and potentially damaging information. And that information might be able to tip their hand and reveal if they're planning on not just building the facility for relocating the Toronto factory, but also outfitting themselves to be processing enriched uranium as a separate process there. So that's and there are other sort of anecdotal points in terms of why that might be happening. The CARN, Citizens Against Radioactive Neighborhoods, has been seeing a lot of website traffic from places in the United States that are associated with developers of small modular nuclear reactors, such as the NuScale, and also a lot from Lynchburg, Virginia, which is where BWXT is based. So I think that they're really kind of like really looking for a home for this. And because they already sort of have a site in Peterborough, I guess they think it might be easier to place it there than trying to place it somewhere where they haven't grandfathered in an operation.
So the plant in Peterborough would just expand. It's not, they wouldn't move it to someplace out in the country.
No, for now they're not doing that. So they're constantly shifting the goalposts. They're wanting to expand the current operation to bring the pelleting operation or the fuel fabrication operation. And the speculation is that they're going to want to then fabricate also enriched uranium fuel.
So can you tell me what are the procedures for, what are the hoops that they have to jump through to get permission to make these changes? And are these additional safety inquiries or public testimony events, or where are the things that you're trying to intervene? How do you foresee you or Adam or the people watching this could take part in a discussion of whether to allow this?
Well, I'll be only working in my capacity as a journalist and sharing information. If they want to go ahead with this, it's as the past has shown, it's simply just a license amendment that would be required. And of course, they'll say that everything is safe and that they're trustworthy. In the United States, where they're co-operator of the Portsmouth gaseous diffusion plant, BWXT is now named as a co-defendant in several class action lawsuits over the contamination of a local elementary school in Pinkerton, Ohio, called Zahn's Corner Elementary School, where they had to actually shut down the school because of the amount of uranium and other radioactive toxins discovered on the school, and where several students over the past few years have died of cancer. So in terms of the fight to stop it, I think that CARN has really, with the assistance of CELA, Canadian Environmental Law Association, they've really jumped through the hoops, and they've really, dotted their I's and crossed their T's. It comes down to political will, because the client for this company is the Canadian government. It's the Ontario federal government. Mm-hmm. And the local MP, Miriam Monsef, has been very reticent to say anything. The mayor, Diane Therrien, in Peterborough has kind of spoken out of both sides of her mouth. So she said she's concerned, but she's been assured that it's safe. But really, the group in Peterborough is really a polite group. I mean, they're calling themselves Citizens Against Radioactive Neighborhoods. They participate in Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission hearings. They've held some pickets, but in the absence of direct action and increasing public pressure, I really don't see how they're going to stop this company from, incrementally increasing their toxic load on the local neighborhood and the kids in the elementary school. It's not just the kids that are more radio sensitive to radiation than adults. It's the entire town. That facility is located right downtown in the middle of town.
Yeah, well, it sounds to me as if the linchpin is the notion that there's a certain somebody has defined what is a safe amount of radiation. How much can you safely endure, accept, and with them, I guess they know that every bit of radiation has some risk and can maybe harm you, but that we just have to live with a certain amount because in nature it occurs. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, how much can be done to question that, or even whether we should question it. Maybe we should believe them. Maybe we should say, okay, you think that I should accept a certain amount of radiation in my life, and so I will do it. And so let's go on and talk to other matters.
And then
I'm a little uncomfortable about that. And is there anything that we can do to kind of challenge that, or at least take it seriously, not just simply believe what we're told?
If I may add a point, and how accessible is this information? In the Toronto context of the BWXT plant, for many years, the GE, before BWXT purchased the facilities for uranium processing in 2016, they were owned by GE, as you mentioned. For many years, the Toronto plant was classified as a ceramics factory. It wasn't until a 1986 bylaw municipal probe that it actually kind of came to the initial foresight that they weren't manufacturing ceramics, but the type of products that they were dealing with may have been considered that under a technicality. So one of my questions, building on what Meta is saying, is how accessible and how clear is the safe limits information for the public? Another thing with the Toronto context, the 9,000 kilograms of uranium being released into the sewer sounds absolutely absurd. But what is meant by that? Because there's often all this technical language, and as such, how accessible is it for a member of the public to go and read one of these documents and know what they're referring to and what actually they are meaning by the safe limits?
It's completely inaccessible. It's a rubber stamp. The 9,000 kilogram release to the sewer allowable per year is calculated based on a dose of 1 millisievert per year to a human body of the public. There's different limits for workers. Workers are technically allowed to be exposed to even more radiation. This is all creative accounting. This is all fun with decimals. It's all manipulating graphs and charts to minimize the fact that half of all nuclear fuel used in Canadian reactors is cooked in a process that releases it to the environment. And also, when we look at it as a hyperlocal issue, it's problematic. But when we look at it as a global issue, it's problematic. From mining to waste. How accessible is the information? It's not. A Geiger counter isn't really going to test for it because Geiger counters are measuring gamma. So unless you have very, very expensive equipment, you're not really, as a citizen, going to be able to show or prove what's going on there. But I think that we can continue asking for transparency, and we can continue demanding. This is where the fight kind of goes more into the area of a social license. Is this company trustworthy? No. Have they been caught lying to the public and the regulator? Yes. Have they been named in class action lawsuits for contaminating and killing children in an elementary school? Yes. There is not a deficit of reasons to not use the precautionary principle here. to say that there isn't a risk that outweighs a benefit to the public. So argumentatively, why does it have to be next to an elementary school, or why anywhere at all? But if you really get down into the weeds of it, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is a quasi-judicial tribunal. They're the poster child of industry capture. There was a, I believe, an Enviros poll of federal scientists, about 5 years ago, that asked them, do you feel like you can speak without being censored and you can share your results? CNSC had, I think, like a resounding majority of their own scientists saying that they felt muzzled, that that their work was either changed and they couldn't be transparent about their information. And that's not just for these nuclear fuel processing facilities. It's for nuclear reactors. It's for uranium mines. The Pickering nuclear reactor, we hear lots of information, and lots of public information has just come to light about how they're basically guesstimating, how safe are these pressure tubes on a reactor that is so many years past its expected life design, and they're not even going to replace the tubes. So they're really risking everything for their own benefit. Pickering is one of the closest reactors to a major metropolitan center. This industry has always been known for playing fast with people's health and safety and the environment. I think there's more than enough reasons to say why they can't be trusted. And back to Meta's points about, okay, yeah, there is natural background radiation, and that is dangerous. Radon gas is dangerous. Radiation is dangerous. We shouldn't be adding any more, but there's a difference between background radiation. You're not inhaling background radiation. You might be if you're exposed to radon coming from underground in a basement, and that's why we have radon testing. But inhaling particles of uranium directly into those sensitive tissue, and especially to the kids who are radiosensitive because their cells are multiplying all the time. But if you actually look at, like, smoking cigarettes or, arsenic, there is no safe level. So there is no good argument for exposing all these people. The argument for it is really to, I guess, turn Peterborough or continue to make Toronto into a sacrificial zone in the name of nuclear power, that we're constantly being bombarded with the idea that it's clean and that it's a solution to climate change, which I argue that it isn't. It's neither clean nor is a solution to climate change. And
you've come to the right person if you want to make that case, because I agree with. I'm predisposed to say, let's do something else. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think.
I may add a point
what
as
else?
well.
Please do, Adam. Yes. Go on.
I want to kind of bridge to a broader issue within, I think, multiple communities in the Canadian nuclear industry, and that's the accessibility within language context. I don't know if you're following the CNSC hearings right now, but there's been a lot of outcry from Canada's Francophone community. I want to ask, within the Toronto context, are materials being made available in both French, but then also other neighborhood languages? The census, and this might be an issue in Peterborough as well, the census shows that the areas surrounding the plant have very high levels of Portuguese, Italian, Spanish, Vietnamese, Chinese, Tagalog, all different languages that may not be able to read a technical report in English. Are they making any attempts to make this material accessible both within Canada's official languages, but other neighborhood languages? I guess both within the Toronto and Peterborough context.
No, all of their attempts are to suppress information and to minimize the information that gets out. So the information that they distribute even now, basically, even in English, is substandard. In English, it basically just says, we're your neighbor, everything is fine, nothing to worry about. And then they may translate that paragraph into French. No, it's not translated into Portuguese, Italian, Chinese, and some of the languages that a lot of people, especially people who've been there for decades, speak as their primary language. But even in terms of the language of the English communications, are always just to say that we're regulated by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. We have thorough inspections by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and it's shown that there's no risk to public health or the environment. That's their communication. But before that, their communication was nil. People didn't even know it was there. The nuclear industry operates on the less information the public knows, the better for them, because they think that nuclear industry is unfairly stigmatized. I would argue that when the public finds out more information, it's just more cause for concerns and leads to more questions that they're not usually able to answer without the, appeal to the rubber stamp of their own authority to say that everything's within safe levels.
Mm-hmm. Well, you are doing really heroic work in as a journalist addressing these issues. So bless your heart, carry on. And maybe we need to keep in touch, because,
thank you.
And thank you so much for this. It's been fascinating, and good luck.
Thank you.
Bye.